Today we have with us Dr. Thomas Kailath, who is one of the most renowned electrical engineer and a pioneer in the field of linear systems and information theory. First of all, I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Mohammad Mirza, to deliver the welcome speech. On to you, Mirza.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
On behalf of Team Tathva, I would like to wish a very pleasant morning to all our attendees today, and we hope that you are keeping well. Since its inception, Tathva has grown to become one of the biggest techno-managerial fests in South India through its efforts and the support extended to us by our parent institute, NIT Calicut. Once again, we are glad to have all of you here with us today. The lecture series has been the highlight of Tathva year after year, and joining us today is our esteemed speaker, Dr. Thomas Kailath. He's an electrical engineer, information theorist, control engineer, entrepreneur, and the Hitachi American Professor of Engineering, Emeritus at Stanford University. Professor Kailath has authored several books, including the well-known book, Linear Systems, which ranks as one of the most referenced books in the field of linear systems. Professor Kailath was elected as a member into the U.S. National Academy of Engineering in 1984 for outstanding contributions in prediction, filtering, and signal processing, and for leadership in engineering. In 2012, Professor Kailath was awarded the National Medal of Science presented by President Barack Obama in 2014 for transformative contributions to the field of information and system science, for distinctive and sustained mentoring of young scholars, and for translation of scientific ideas into entrepreneurial ventures that have had a significant impact on industry. Professor Kailath is listed as an ISI highly cited researcher and is generally recognized as one of the preeminent figures of 20th century electrical engineering. This evening, Professor Thomas Kailath will talk on his technical journey from College of Engineering Pune to MIT, Caltech, and Stanford. Do join me in welcoming him to the Tathva lecture series. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was a nice introduction. So, I'm very happy to be here. I spent quite a bit of time looking at the website of, hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Looking at the website of NIT Calicut. It still keeps the name Calicut, though I can't pronounce correctly the ZH sound, but you can say what it's called these days, code. But what was I going to say? No, you have a beautiful campus. And I was looking at the curriculum of the electronics and communications, and it's very comparable to the best universities anywhere in the world. So actually, I think the graduates will probably be better trained than many people in American universities and so on. So you have good teachers, a good curriculum, and so on. However, more important than all the facts that you find in your subjects and so on, because facts you can always refer to from books or nowadays on Wikipedia and on websites and so on. What's more important is learning how to think and learning how to learn. Because one of the things of the modern day is things are changing so fast that you will have to keep learning all your life. You need lifelong learning. So you need the skills of how to learn independently by reading, thinking about it, talking to other people, referring to books, magazines, and so on. How to learn and master a subject to the degree that you need for your immediate purposes. Because, otherwise you can spend all your time studying. This is one of the problems that PhD students have. They don't want to start research. They said, I need to take one more course in this field to broaden my horizons and so on. No, you just have to, jump in and start. So, and then, with practice, you will learn how to learn. That's important. Okay. So, I'm looking at your questions, and you want to say, how did education in Pune differ from what happened when I came to MIT? Well, the College of Engineering Pune, known as COEP, is one of the oldest colleges in India, second only to Roorkee. And it was started in 1856. I remember the date because I graduated in 1956, which was the centenary of the College of Engineering, Pune. And it was at that time one of the best known universities, engineering schools in India. And in fact, one of its distinctions is that India's most famous engineer, he was knighted by the British government, Sir M.V. Visvesvaraya, who worked in Karnataka, built the Krishnaya Sagar Dam and many other buildings and so on. So he's probably India's most famous engineer. He was a graduate, early graduate from COEP. I was fortunate that I had an outstanding professor there. And this is what I want to say, you know, it's important in one's life to have certain mentors and teachers who inspire you and guide you in what to do. And in fact, it started for me in high school. I should tell you that, you know, these days, my work is mostly mathematical. And most people think of me as a mathematician, actually. So I have a lot of awards in mathematics. But in school, in the early grades, I was a very poor student in mathematics. But I was always top of the class because, first of all, I inherited from my father a good memory. And so I also had good language skills. So even though my grades in mathematics was not very good, nevertheless, I was one of the top students. So in, I think, the 6th standard, I came to the class, and in India, you know, you sit in, things have changed now. I grew up at a time when there were probably only 30 students in the class, and you sat in the classroom, and the teacher, different teachers came and taught you. So the mathematics professor was a very unique individual. In Pune, I lived in what's called the cantonment. You're not familiar with that in Calicut or in Kerala, but where the British had their troops, the place where their army bases were called cantonments. And those were somewhat more cosmopolitan places than the city of Pune, which was very orthodox, lot of, people of all ranges, but known for a particular class of Brahmins called the Chitpavan Brahmins. And the math teacher came from that community. And he was quite unique. He would, while most of the teachers in the school, it was called St. Vincent's High School, mission school like many in India. And at my time, the teachers were, some of them were Swiss-Italian fathers, Jesuit fathers, and some Indian teachers as well. So this math teacher came from this, so they wore, suits and ties and so on, but he would come in his dhoti, white dhoti, walking from 2 or 3 miles to school from the city to the cantonment. And he would come into class. He was a somewhat fearsome teacher, and sit cross-legged on the chair in front of us, take a pinch of snuff, and then start his daily routines. And the daily routines were somewhat fearsome for the students because he would pick on the first student, ask him some question, and the poor person would not know the answer or would stumble and so on. So he would make some sarcastic remark and move to the next student. So this was, people were really afraid of him. So I was in that class, and I was, as I mentioned earlier, not very good in math. But nevertheless, when I entered the class, he knew my record. So he says, "Oh, I'm looking forward to working with you." And of course, that petrified me. Okay. But small things help in different ways. In those days, we had desks for the students, but desks of 2 students each. So a row of desks like this. But in that year, there were 2 extra students. So they put a desk in front of just 2 people and then the whole row of this. Now, it so happens that I happen to be in this long row leftmost. So Mr. Joshi would come and start his usual routine, pick on the first student, humiliate him, move to the next one. But he was too lazy to start again from the left. So he would jump to the third student in my row. So I avoided humiliation in the beginning. Okay. Secondly, things interesting how things work out. There were 2 sections in the class, and the second section was taught by Mr. Joshi could easily have been a college professor, but for various reasons, he used to tutor college students, but he became a high school teacher, and he was a little not too happy with that. However, so the other section was taught by someone who was much more of a plodder, and he would give a lot of homework, and he would draw the questions, exam questions from the homework. And Mr. Joshi was too big a man to prepare the exam, so he would ask Mr. Tembe, who was the other teacher, to make the exams. And as I just mentioned, he would draw the problems for the exam from his previous homework. So I had a friend in that class, and I said, can I borrow your notes so that I can see what he's teaching in the problems? And in the beginning, I just memorized I had a good memory, so I memorized all the problems and the solutions. And so I managed to start out reasonably well in the examinations, which were set by him. But this was a subject, we also started geometry. And we had actually Euclid. There's a book, I don't know what you have now. We had Hall and Knight, geometry, which followed Euclid's pattern, proposition, axioms, propositions, theorem 1, 2, and so on. And after a while, I began to follow the logic of it. And I thought, hey, this is an interesting subject, and you don't need to memorize, as in most of the classes, you can think about it. And so we had a small group of students who would study together, and we would take these problems from the next set. And the competition was between us, who would think of the solution first. And so my strategy was I would think of the first step and raise my hand and said, yes, I got it. And while I was explaining the first step, my brain would be cranking, what's the next step? So the logic helps you in that. You don't need memory. You just have to think about how these steps are. So I began to enjoy geometry and doing these problems and so on. And I should tell you a story. There's a very famous English writer called Thomas Carlyle, and he was a lawyer also. And one day he happened to be at a friend's house, and open on the shelf there was Euclid, the book. And he started to look at it, and he saw proposition theorem. He read it, and he says, yeah, well, this makes sense. I can understand it, and so on. So, people who are lawyers have to be very clear in their thinking, because they have to be very precise. There should be no ambiguity in what their sentences are, because otherwise, the law would be not properly applied and so on. So that appealed to me, geometry, and I began to enjoy it. And then, so in India at that time, we used to have this issue of tuition. Now, I didn't really need tuition, but in the summertime, Mr. Joshi would hold catch-up classes for the students Indian summer, who needed to repeat the subject and so on. So I would attend those. And I'm just showing off a little bit. He would come in beginning, hand out a sheet of paper with 30 problems and say, okay, start on this. And I would manage to do it fairly soon. So I would show it to him, and he was very pleased. So we became friends in a way, and we kept up that friendship even after I went to college. And even I used to visit him when I came back from MIT to India. He was also very helpful in a different way. I lived in the cantonment, which is a very cosmopolitan place. My neighbors were from Bengal, from Gujarat, from Rajasthan, Goa, Mangalore, Kerala, and so on. So the common language actually was English. And what was I going to say? So the local college was called Wadia College. It's a well-known college in Pune, in the cantonment. But by Indian standards, it was known as, in America now, the word party school. The students were not very motivated in studies. They were enjoying life as freedom, leaving home for some of them, but otherwise just being in college. So he said to me, no, you are really better than that. You should go to Ferguson College, which is in the city of Pune, which was about, I may be wrong now, I think 6 miles away from my home in the cantonment. But it was a very famous old college started by the bishop, the governor of Bombay province. It was called Ferguson. And it had very high standards, academic standards and so on. So he said, no, you have to go there. And in fact, so I would, Pune was at that time the city of bicycles. Next to Amsterdam, it had the most bicycles in the world. Now, of course, when I went back, it's all cars and two-wheelers and three-wheelers and so on, and much more crowded than in my days. So I would bicycle there, and that was a good education. We had at that time what was called FY and Inter. In 2 years, we had 11 years of school, and then 2 years, first year and intermediate it was called. And then you went to BSc or medicine and so on, which are 3-year courses. So my engineering college was 3 years. Okay. Now, the fact that I had 11 years in school was helpful, because when I applied to MIT, you have to go through US visa system. And they won't admit you to schools in America unless you have 16 years of school education. So that was fortunate that I had 11 plus 2 plus 3. Now for you people, it's 10 plus 2 plus 4 or 5 years in college. So no problem there. But for me, that was lucky. So, so I got the ranking system for for this intermediate exam was statewide, maybe 100,000 students and so on. And they ranked the students. And your admission to engineering college or medical college and so on depended on your rank. And which major you chose, they went down the list and you had first choice of majors. Well, in Pune at that time, this is another fortunate experience. There was a very outstanding professor called Professor Chandrasekharaya, who was a student of the famous Indian physicist and founder of atomic energy, Homi Bhabha, who was in the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And Ayya was his student there. And then he joined government service with Bombay Education Service. But he was also someone, he was a lifelong learner. When the field was changing, he would change with it. He would keep up with the journals and so on. And uniquely among professors of engineering at the time, he would do some research. He started a PhD program in Pune in telecom, which was probably the first PhD program in an engineering college in India. And so he was the professor of a fairly elite course at the time, telecommunications engineering. So our program is different from yours. Your programs nowadays are very much like the American programs and so on. We had first year common to all branches of engineering, civil, mechanical, metallurgy, electrical. So you had to do everything common. Surveying, workshop. I was very bad at workshop. And metallurgy, and of course, structures, applied mechanics, things like that. I've always totally forgotten all of those things. And some mathematics courses. So the second year you started with one subject, which was power engineering. And then in the third year was your major. So the third year was telecom, which was largely radio engineering. And we had just one textbook, which was, uniquely enough or coincidentally, was written by a very famous Stanford professor who was responsible for the growth of Stanford, actually, and for the foundation of Silicon Valley, Frederick Terman. And his first students were Hewlett and Packard. And you've all heard of HP, the company. So he encouraged them to start Hewlett Packard. And he had a famous textbook called Radio Engineering, which was by then in the 4th edition. It was known as the Bible for radio engineers. And that was our only textbook. Okay. Now, it's quite interesting, actually, that he was a very practical person, and his textbook was no mathematics in it, no equation, very few equations and so on, but mostly descriptions of circuits, amplifiers, and so on. Switching circuits, things like that, hardly ever taught these days, in America or even in your college and most colleges in India. So anyway, but he was, as I said, he started a PhD program. And though he wasn't a very good lecturer, he was an inspiring figure. He encouraged people to be confident, to say, it's not so much what exactly you know. You should be able to learn and study by yourself and be confident and learn how to speak well and write well. That's important. And that, again, I should say, many people tell me that, when they recruit people, it's very important for them that they have communication skills and writing skills, which engineers don't always have and don't pay attention to, actually. To write logically, clearly, each sentence must have a relation to the previous sentence. A theme, an idea needs to be developed. So I think you have classes in writing and so on. It's very important to pay attention to that. So, and he was very good at that. And that also helped me because, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll jump to it. When I applied to very few people went abroad for studies at that time. In fact, I was the only student out of the 10 or 12 in my batch who applied to go overseas. Okay, and you need, of course, grades, and I had good grades, but you need a reference letter from your professors. Nowadays, probably 2 or 3, but at that time, 1 was enough. And many people in my college could not write letters properly. If a student wanted a reference, they say, why don't you write it and I'll sign it? Okay. But Professor Raya was different. He studied in Cambridge, by the way. He had a Cambridge degree, and then came back and taught it, as I said, worked with Baba. Baba sent him to Cambridge, came back and then became an educationist. And so he wrote a very nice letter for me, which helped me to get admission to Harvard and MIT because I decided to apply. Actually, I hadn't thought of doing that, but a family friend, a very distinguished person, and if you see, you'll find his name in the acknowledgements of if you have time or a look at my book of linear systems, I have acknowledgements, and this is a Dr. Krishnaya. He was a remarkable individual again. He got a PhD in education from Columbia University in 1929. Hardly any Indians went abroad to study at that time. He did, but he came back to India and he was inspector of schools. So the inspector of schools, I don't have that custom now. He would come to the different schools and the teachers would pick some students from each class who would make a few remarks, and he would ask them questions to see what they knew and so on. So he knew me from there. But also he was a Christian, though he was a Punjabi. His name was Ganugapati Stephen Krishnaya. And he went to the same church that my family and I did. So we knew him from there. And so he also knew me from the school. And so he said to me in the church one day, what are you thinking of doing? I said, well, there are not many jobs. There are only 2 jobs available for our major here, All India Radio or Post and Telegraphs or the railways. So an IAS, but for the IAS, I had very thick glasses, and so that you could not join the IAS. So he said, no, you should go abroad. I said, no, that's not possible. He said, no, you should think about it. And again, this lucky circumstance, he used to, in those days it was common, make lecture tours to America, because he had started uniquely a children's magazine following what he had seen in America, because he was the educational attaché in Washington for 2 years. So he would visit various universities, talk to the leaders and so on. When he came back to India, he started a magazine for children. It was very popular for a few years till he passed away. So he would make lecture tours to America to talk about this and raise money for his magazine and so on. So he said to me, I'm going to America, in a few months. Have your professor write a letter of recommendation and give me your transcripts. And when I go to different places, I will speak, I usually speak to the heads of the universities, and I will give them your transcripts. So he went to Harvard and MIT, and those were the 2 places I was interested in. And actually, I got offers first from Harvard for a teaching assistantship. But I'd already heard about this subject called information theory, which is a somewhat mathematical subject. And as I told you, I was beginning to be more interested in math. And in the math textbooks, I would often go to the last chapter and try to study that chapter by myself in the calculus books and so on. So information theory was a very mathematical subject, founded in 1948 by Claude Shannon from Bell Labs. Okay. Now it's a huge subject, and his title was not information theory, but called a mathematical theory of communication. And a lot of all the advances in communication, signal processing, control, and so on, came from his formulations of a mathematical way of thinking about communications. So I had written to Shannon, actually, because I read about this in Popular Mechanics, a magazine, or Popular Electronics, I forget what it is now. And I sent him this aerogram from India, a letter saying, Bell Labs has these reports. So I couldn't afford to purchase his book on information theory, but the Bell Labs reports, he sent them to me. And I mentioned to him that I have got admission to MIT, and so I'll be going there, later this year. So he wrote back saying, yes, well, here are the reports. I'm happy to hear from you. You're the first person from India that probably wrote to him. And normally I don't reply to letters, so they just lie on my desk. But from India, that was unique. So he wrote to me and he said, moreover, I'm going to MIT myself. I'm leaving Bell Labs and I'll be joining MIT. So that was good. So that's how I ended up at MIT. Okay. So I think that was one of your questions. How did I end up at MIT? So, right. Now, that was question 3. Share your academic life from St. Vincent's and the teachers, professors, and friends who motivated you. Well, that's very important, actually. You learn more from your friends, actually, than from the professors, because the professor only teaches you one subject, but your friends take all the subjects. And if they're interesting people, they can tell you about what interests them and so on. So it's important to make a collection of friends with whom you can discuss things, not necessarily only academic, but political and so on. And I was very fortunate, especially in the engineering college, where we had this restricted group of 10 or 12 students who were all, as I said, they were the toppers in the state examination, and they chose telecom. So one of my classmates was called Prabhakar Devdar. And again, very interesting. Most people, when they graduate from engineering college, would take a government job. Those were basically the only jobs available at the time. There were no industry. But he was unique. He said, no, I don't want to work for someone else. He had a knack for building equipment and so on. He said he'll start a company. So he had a company called Applied Electronics, or App Lab, actually, he called it. And he made different products which he sold and so on. And so he was my classmate. And Rajiv Gandhi, so this is an interesting story, was a pilot working for Air India and Indian Airlines and so on in Bombay. And the other had moved to Bombay. And he was very interested in hi-fi because he was a music lover and so on. And the other's friend had a shop which supplied hi-fi equipment. I forget his name now, his friend's name. But so Rajiv Gandhi used to frequent that shop, and Devdar was his technical consultant. So they got to know each other. And so he helped Rajiv to, buy the proper hi-fi equipment and so on. And then later, when Rajiv followed his mother and became prime minister, he remembered Devdar and invited him to Delhi and said, I'll make you in charge. He was Minister of State for Electronics. And he worked there for many years. He had some innovations and so on. But finally, he was frustrated by the bureaucracy and by the IAS, I must say, which is not really the best system for developing technology. Because IAS officers get transferred every 2 or 3 years. They're supposed to be generalists. They don't specialize in any particular subject. And they're not, so they never become, while they have to take decisions about high-tech subjects and so on, they don't have a staff that will guide them as to what to do and so on. So things don't work very well. So he had many interesting ideas. Some of them got implemented. He built the first ATM, for example. But they said, we can't put it in practice till you have 200 installations and we know they work. Well, how can you do that? That was just one example of things he had, which could have been early for India, but never made it. He's still very active, writing articles, papers, and so on. P.S. Devdar, D-E-O-D-H-A-R. You can look him up sometime. Very interesting. So he was my classmate. Another classmate was Hari Wagle. He retired as head of TRAI, Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India, and so on. So it was, we had a good collection of students. And when I went to MIT, it was also a very unique time. It was later called the Golden Age, the 10 years. I went in 57, but starting in 56 or so, 55, 56, there was a group of students who, 7 or 8 or 10 students, who made many pioneering contributions to communications. Okay. Now, one of them was a man called Jacob Ziv. He came from Israel, actually, and he was a classmate of mine at MIT. And every program in computers is compressed using a compression algorithm known as the Lempel-Ziv algorithm, because his co-author was Lempel and they go alphabetically, though the ideas are mostly Ziv's ideas. So that was one. Another is a famous information theorist, Robert Gallagher. His book is the best book in the field of information theory. An old book now, but still the best book. A third one was Ivan Sutherland. He is the inventor of computer graphics. And I remember him showing me, those days, you had only two kinds of computer. I mean, you only had the big IBM computer, which was very difficult to use. You had Fortran programming. You people don't know these, but you have to carefully print out a set of instructions, and these are made into punch cards. You take it to the computer center, they run it, they find some flaw because you made a mistake, so you get it back 2 days later, and so on. So, but the first workstations from Digital Equipment Corporation were beginning to be produced, and they gave MIT some of them. So Ivan had that. So he had a little workstation screen and so on. It wasn't called a workstation, but just a terminal. And he showed me one day, he said, look, I've written a program. You draw a square by hand on the graphic screen. It's not very accurate because you can't get the corner. And my program will clean it up and make a perfect square. Or if you make architecture drawing of a house and so on, you sketch it and my program will clean it up and give it to you. So that's computer graphics, Ivan Sutherland. Now, the inventor of modems was David Forney, and he was 2 years junior to me and so on. And my advisor was Wozencraft, as you've asked about him. He was a very interesting person. That was not his career. He was a graduate of the military academy in America called West Point. And so they choose students after high school to go through this thing, and then they're made officers. And he ranked first in West Point. And then he was in the army, but he became a major and so on. But he really had engineering interests and so on. So he invented something in the army. So he was sent to the research labs of the Army Research Lab in New Jersey, and he invented something called the integrate and dump filter. You integrate, that builds up charge on a capacitor. Then you have to discharge the capacitor fast so that you can do it again. So integrate and dump. And so after a while, the military said to him, why don't you go to MIT and get a higher education? So he went and he got a master's there. And then he went back to the military, but he got tired of it and he said, no, I'm resigning and I'm going to go back to MIT and do my PhD. And so I think in 1955, he came back to MIT. And in 2 years, he finished his PhD on doing a very interesting piece of work. Excuse me. Shannon's information theory said that you can achieve certain fast communication rates and so on. But his proof was very interesting. It didn't show you how to do it. It just showed, by those of you who take information theory know about it, it's called random coding. He proved that there must exist a way of doing this accurately and fast, okay? But no one knew how to do it, okay? In fact, the joke was that every scheme that you thought of didn't work. So only the schemes that you could not think of were the good ones, okay? But Wozencraft found a scheme called sequential decoding for not quite achieving the maximum rate, but still the only scheme that signaled at a reasonable rate and with good error probability. So that was called sequential decoding. So they put him on the faculty. And 57, he started on the faculty. And that's the year that I got admitted to MIT. Okay. So I was a new student there, and it's quite interesting. Many famous professors there. David Huffman, those of you in information theory study something called Huffman coding for data compression. Robert Whanau, very remarkable person who worked in many, many fields, from electromagnetics to circuits to information theory to computers and so on, Robert Whanau. And so he was one of the professors, Peter Elias and so on. So Whanau was the head of the information theory group. So when I went to MIT, first you go to the lab, it's called the Research Lab of Electronics. That's where I was assigned. And the general person interviews you. And interesting story. He told us, you're a research assistant, so you're supposed to spend 50% time on research. So while a Norman student takes 4 subjects per semester, you can take 2. So, but you are paid for it. So, you don't have to pay tuition and you can get an education, but it'll take you twice as long as a regular student and so on. So I said to him, but that's true, but can we audit classes? In other words, listen to classes without taking the exam and so on. So he said, of course, you can do what you want. He said, there are, tell me, what is it? 24 times 7, 168 hours in a week. So, you can do what you want. There's 168 hours in the week. So I did audit a few classes that way, but I went to see Whanau. And at that time, he was already very famous. So he was quite young, actually. Was 34 probably in 1956. So I went and I stood outside his door and he saw me and he said, come in. So I said, I'm now a new student in information theory group. And so they asked me to introduce myself. He said, oh, come in. I'm Robert Whanau. I'm Bob Whanau, and what's your name? No, he said, what's your name? Thomas Kailath. He said, well, okay, so we'll call you Tom, and you can call me Bob. Okay, well, for many years, I could only call my professors and all my doctors also. I never used their first name. I say professor or so on. So till many years later, I became familiar enough that I could say Bob and Jack, Wozencraft with Jack and so on. But anyway, so that was Whanau. But to show you the attention that they pay to new students. So he said, so have you thought about the classes that you're going to take? I said, yes, I can only take 2 classes. And I mentioned 2 of them, taught by 2 famous people. You won't know the names now, Gilliman in circuits and Lee for statistical communication theory. So he said, well, they're good courses and good people, but let me make a couple of suggestions. There's a young professor called Siebert, and he teaches in 2 weeks what Professor Lee takes the whole semester to do. So I suggest that you take his class. And then Gilliman is a famous professor. I was his student and so on. And actually, there's an interesting story. Gilliman was of German origin. So he got his PhD in Germany, and his supervisor was a famous physicist called Sommerfeld, Arnold Sommerfeld, whose students were Heisenberg and Pauli and so on. Okay, so there's something called the math genealogy tree. You're a student, your professor is Wozencraft, his professor is Whanau, Whanau's professor is Sommerfeld, and you trace the tree and you find Gauss in the tree. So in some way, I'm a descendant of Gauss. Okay. So anyway, so that was Gilliman. So he said, oh, Gilliman is famous and so on. He was my professor. But there's a teaching assistant who teaches a course, and he'll teach a better course than Gilliman, even though it's a low-level course compared to Gilliman's graduate course, but you should take him. So, I wasn't sure. I thought, should I not take it from the famous professor? So I went back to my desk. They give the students desks. And half an hour later comes this young lecturer, Tom Stockham. Whanau had sent him to see me to persuade me that I should take his class rather than Gilliman's class. So that shows you the level of interest that professors pay to their research students. Now, for undergraduates, it's different, of course, but at MIT, the teaching assistants used to spend a lot of time preparing their homework problems, the examinations, giving special classes and so on. So it was a very important position, and Tom Stockham was very well regarded as a teaching assistant. But anyway, so I took his course and so on. So, sorry, there's one more story. So when I looked at the schedule, Stockham's class conflicted with Siebert's class, the one that Whanau wanted me to take. So I said to him, no, I can't take your section, but there's a second section, so I can take that section. He thought about it and said, no, don't bother, take Gilliman's course, because he didn't think much of the teacher of the other section. So, good advice to me and so on. So the professors are like Aya for me and Wozencraft later and Whanau and Elias and so on. Teachers can have a very important role in your life, and it's important to build connections with good teachers and so on. So now the difference in education was in Pune also, except in mathematics, everything was based on memorization. You had to study, how to make ammonia one year, the next year, how to make, carbon dioxide or something, how to build Class C amplifiers or switching, what's the telephone switching circuit and so on. So all based on memory, okay? And even IS classes based on memory. When you went to MIT, no, you had to reason things out. The exams were open book. You could bring your notes, your book and all that, take the examination. If you haven't understood it properly, you'll take a long time figuring out what the answer is from the book. So you should understand what things are going on. So that was the explanation. And that was the difference in education. The courses force you to think about things and not rely on memory. Okay. Now, therefore, for example, in my lectures, there's sort of mathematical lectures, but I never used notes because I knew, you had to develop the subject. So you start with the first sentence and there's mostly mathematically oriented classes. So as I said, in doing proofs in geometry, you can go step by step. And so you don't need notes because you reason it out as you are talking. Okay. So it's important to develop that skill. And if you have teachers who do that, and probably you have many of them, that would be worthwhile. So that was your question. Share your academic life, the teachers, professors, and friends who have motivated and guided you. So I was lucky. I was in the golden age of information theory. And then, let's see, how long have I taken? When did we start?
We started at 10 a.m.
Another 10 minutes? Okay. So I'll just pick up one of your questions. Well, I've done more. How was your experience in MIT? Was it different from Pune? I told that. I spoke about Wozencraft. Now you want to know what scientific field is on the verge of potential growth and how it will affect us on a grand scale. Well, I'm not very good at prediction, as they said, and prediction of the future is difficult. Someone said prediction is difficult, especially of the future. So, but I think certainly robotics is one area that is going to grow. And in many ways, helping older people, for example, helping students learn and so on. Robotics is one. And artificial intelligence, mathematically based artificial intelligence can be useful. Okay. It's a broad subject. There's a lot of hype about it, but and there's a lot of things that are not fully understood. You may have heard of something called deep learning. Well, it works because you have lots of data and lots of huge computing power, but nobody understands why deep learning works. And people are beginning to study that, and so on, including some of my friends. Nevertheless, AI is one of the broad areas that are important in the future. Achieving success in a particular field requires passion. How did you recognize your passion? And I told you about that, okay. Yeah, so let me close with Wozencraft's suggestion to you. The question is, Wozencraft suggested the topic of making a mathematical model for constantly changing channels. Now, those of you in communications know that there's a famous communication system called RAKE, which appears in, it was originally developed for combating jamming and multipath. You know, signals from one point to another point can go safer through the ionosphere by reflections, one reflection, two reflections, and so on. So you get multiple paths, and you have to sort of figure out how to recombine them in phase so that they all add together in the right way. So the system called RAKE does that. And it was developed by two people at MIT Lincoln Lab, which is a research lab associated with MIT doing government classified work. So Wozencraft asked me to study. He said, you know, the channels that they're working with change with time and change randomly. So they have a system. It was based on the two people who developed it called Price and Green. It was based on Price's thesis, but with modifications and so on. But it's not working all the time, and they're not quite sure what's happening. Okay. So it turns out in my thesis, Wozencraft gave me the problem of you have a channel which you can only access by putting a signal into it and measuring the output. You can't go inside the channel. Okay. So, but the channel is changing with time. So find a way of designing an input signal which will keep up with the changing channel so that from the output, you can figure out what's actually happening in the channel, okay? So to make a long story short, for a long time, I had one scheme for doing that, but the question is there a better scheme? Okay. And there's a condition for doing it, and it's called, what, for those of you in mathematics, a sufficient condition, but is it necessary? So I found a sufficient condition, a way of doing it, but I struggled to find, is it the best way? Is it necessary, this condition? So, you know, you don't meet your professors all the time. So once a month or so, I would see him one day, so I'm in the hall. He said, how are you doing on this problem? I said, sorry, I can't do it. You know, give me another problem. So he said, okay, you know, that's fine. Sometimes things don't work out. Why don't you write up what you were doing, what problems you were facing, why you couldn't make progress? So I said, okay, and I started to write it out. And in the course of doing that, I figured out a simple argument which gave me the condition under which you could identify this channel from the input and the output measurements. Okay. So it was an interesting argument called degrees of freedom, which is not a mathematically rigorous argument, but is widely used by Shannon and others. It's called a heuristic argument. And I use that with some justifications. And I said, this is not mathematically kosher, but, you know, there's lots of evidence that it works, and Shannon has used it and so on. That was in when did I get my master's? 59. Well, it was very interesting because Wozencraft told my result. He was a consultant at Lincoln Lab to the inventors of Rake. And he said, Tom has this result on when you can identify this channel. I said, that's wonderful, because those are precisely the condition under which our system Rake fails. When you cannot identify the channel, Rake fails. Okay. So they were very happy with it. and let me take 2 or 3 minutes more. So they were pleased. But I was finishing my master's, and Bell Labs, where Shannon was and so on, he had left by that time, was recruiting and made me a very attractive offer at a high salary and said, you can take lectures from famous people, Shelkinov, Bodhi, Slepian, and so on, and you can get credit at Columbia and you can get a PhD at Columbia, and you'll have a very high salary compared to the $200 or so that I was getting as a student at MIT. So I was very tempted, and Wozencraft told Price and Green, the inventors of Rake, Tom is thinking of going to Bell Labs. So one day they called me up and I said, we'd like to have lunch with you. So they came and they said to me, we know your work, it's very good work and so on. But I know you're thinking of going to Bell Labs, but let us tell you something. The hardest, sometime you may want to get a PhD, and the hardest thing for a PhD is finding a good topic to work on. And you already have one where you made some progress. So think about staying at MIT and, continuing to work in that area. Now you have, it's good to have more money, of course. So what we can do is we can give you a summer job, and that will give you, at a reasonable salary, so you'll have enough to finish your studies and so on. Moreover, while you cannot work at Lincoln Lab because it's classified, I would go occasionally there, and even to the bathroom, somebody has to come with you and stand outside to make sure that you're not talking some secrets away and so on. So I said, moreover, you can work with Bob Price, and he will come and meet you at MIT. So he became effectively my PhD advisor and mentor in many ways. He was very particular about writing clearly and well, lots of references and so on, Robert Price. And when he passed away, I had the honor of writing the memorial tribute for him for the National Academy of Engineering and so on. So, that's how it happened. Now, how I came to Stanford is another story for some other time. Okay, but I'll stop now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for answering questions. Your words were so inspiring and enlightening. Now we can have a short Q&A session from the participants. The participants can put the questions in the chat now. And I request Bhagyalakshmi and Manu to read out the questions to Dr. Thomas.
Now you may have to tell me what the questions are if I don't hear it properly.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
We will now be reading out the questions that you have
Good
received
morning.
from the
Good
participants.
morning to you, actually. Okay.
Yes, sir. Sure. Sir, we will be now reading out the questions we have received from the participants. So the first question is, sir, you have supervised a lot of PhD theses. So how do you think the interest of students in areas like semiconductor electronics, information theory, linear systems, etc. has changed throughout the years?
Well, the subjects are always changing. Semiconductor technology has changed from the early years, point contact transistors and so on, to now FinFETs and three-dimensional transistors and so on. So technology is always changing. And the method of making transistors also is changing. The subject called lithography, which is the bottleneck for making these things. And actually we did some work in that, which led to one of the companies that my students and I co-founded. So the technology is always changing. And, so there's room for improvement always. That's all I can say.
So we will move on with the next question. The question is, so what inspired you to write the book Linear Systems?
Right. Sorry, say the question again.
What inspired you to write the book Linear Systems?
That's very interesting. Good question. Thank you. I was working in something called feedback communications, which, you have at that time, we were interested in satellite communication. And the problem is, on a satellite, you can have only very limited power, but on the ground, you can have a lot of power. So the link from satellite to ground is noisy. The noise has a lot of influence on it. But from ground to satellite is practically, you can have a lot of power. So it's a clean link. So the question is how to exploit this capability that one link is clear and the other is poor. So you can use feedback. Satellite sends a signal, you can see what that is, and you know something about the channel. So you can send a message back, which can be very accurately received at the satellite, which can then change its signal to take account of this information. So that's called feedback communications. But the best way of doing that is using something called the Kalman filter, which is based on, in linear systems, on what is called state space models, those of you who work in this field. Now, that was not something I had studied before, but I needed it, obviously. So I looked at some papers, and I had met Kalman many years ago in 1960 and so on. So I decided to learn that subject, and I decided that the best way of learning is to offer a course in that subject. So I started to offer that course, and I was not happy with the textbooks that were present. So I started to develop, because they were, most of the textbooks, they were good textbooks, but they would spend the first half of the book mathematical prerequisites and so on, and then talk about the problems. And I said, no, that's, the students get bored by the time they don't see why you're studying all this math. So in linear systems, I introduce the math just when it's needed to understand the problem. So if you look at the book, it's developed in what I call a spiral way. So I decided, I was not happy with the textbooks, and I had a number of students who helped me develop that subject. And if you read the acknowledgements of my book, they're mentioned. And one of them is from Kerala, actually, my son-in-law, Professor George Verghese from MIT. So that's what led me to write the book Linear Systems.
Sir, can we ask a few more questions?
Go ahead.
Please feel free to tell us when you need to stop taking questions. So the next question is, what role do industries play in shaping good scientific research?
Well, things are changing there. In the old days, there were big research laboratories in industry. Bell Labs, for example, was very famous. Okay. And because they were a utility, the telephone company had a monopoly of telephone business in those days. And so they made a lot of money, and a percentage of that they gave to Bell Labs to say, you do whatever research you want. It should have some connection eventually with the telephone business, but we know that fundamental research will always have them. So Bell Labs, therefore, with that philosophy, the transistor was invented at Bell Labs. Nobody knew what its applications would be. The laser was invented there. Charge-coupled devices, many, many things were invented there. IBM was similarly that way, GE. But then as competition grew, Bell Labs AT&T was broken up and into 3 divisions and so on. And Bell Labs now doesn't do any fundamental research anymore. And all the fundamental research labs are essentially gone. So industry still does some innovation, but basically they're relying on universities to do the research and come up with the fundamental new ideas. And so they support universities also. But the strength of America is its research universities, so that's where the innovation is done.
So we have another question. How does being part of technical organizations like IEEE help the students?
Oh, IEEE is a remarkable organization. It's the world, it has over 400,000 members. And their main product is journals, okay? And having conferences where people meet and so on. Now, what's unique about it, so these are very prestigious journals, the IEEE journals, they're carefully refereed and so on, but it's all done by volunteers. The people who review the papers are not paid for it. They do it because then their papers will get reviewed and so on. So IEEE has been very critical in the development of electronic technology. And what was I going to say? Through their publications and journals and through their conferences. And another very important activity is standards. You know, when you make products, a company can invent a new kind of modem, but nobody will allow you to have a monopoly, okay? So the basic thing of the modems has to be public knowledge and has to be a standard for it so that other people can build this model. Now, you can have, therefore, the basic product, but each company can add its own improvements and features called bells and whistles. You can add the bells and whistles and so on. But so IEEE standards activity is very important and they play a role in that. And companies spend a lot of effort. Qualcomm, for example, you know, which invents new chips for cell phones and so on. Standards activity is very important, and IEEE is a leader in that. So the volunteer activity, the journals, the conferences, and the standards activity is very important.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for answering all our questions. I guess we can wind up the session. What do you think, sir?
Sorry?
We can wind up the session.
Oh, sure.
Okay, sir. Then we can proceed to the vote of thanks. I would like to invite Haris for the vote of thanks. Haris, on to you.
Good evening, sir.
Hello.
So, greetings to everyone present here. I, Haris Muhammad, am privileged to deliver the vote of thanks for this event. First and foremost, we are deeply thankful to you, sir, Dr. Thomas Kailath, for joining us at Tathva 21 to speak on a technical journey from College of Engineering Pune to MIT, Caltech, and Stanford. I would also like to thank and congratulate the members of the Tathva Lecture Committee on yet another successful session hosted as part of the Tathva Lectures. We also express our gratitude to our audience for their active participation and for their interest in this topic. Once again, I wish to thank Dr. Thomas Kailath for setting aside time from his busy schedule for this event and sharing with us his experiences. We hope we may be able to have you on campus for future editions of Tathva. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and goodbye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I enjoyed the evening. Thank you. Okay.
Where is their campus?
Where
is their campus?
Oh, in west coast of India, east coast, west coast of India. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can end the session.
Good.
Bye, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
They're waiting.
Yeah.
Participants can now leave the meet. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.